listening and watching this debate, and they've had someone tell them, well, you're not really doing enough in Saskatchewan. You haven't done your share in the first place. Don't let them say that to you, is my message, Mr. Speaker. Because there's not another jurisdiction in all of this nation that has made a larger public sector investment in actually doing something about CO2 emissions, and that's the Boundary Dam 3 project near Estevan. That's the only post-combustion capture unit in the world that's today operating and successfully operating, a project that only months ago our friends across the way wanted to wind down, and thank goodness that we didn't. 800,000 tons will be captured this year alone. That's the equivalent of 200,000 cars off the road. But it is the largest per capita public investment made in the country. So if someone says to you as a Saskatchewan resident, well, you haven't done your share, you can actually point out that fact that the Boundary Dam 3 is actually representative of us doing a per capita more of our share than anywhere else we're aware of, not just in Canada, but perhaps of any subnational government in North America. Almost a year ago now, we announced another part of our plan, and that was simply to move Sask Power to 50% renewables by 2030. I think that's a goal that was shared by members opposite. That's part of our plan, to actually do something about emissions, not price it or cap it and trade it and shift it around and try to hopefully find a market that might work, but actually do something about the problem. We added to that, Mr. Speaker, in our white paper. We talked about the importance of increasing support for adaptation, because the evidence of climate change is real, and you only have to talk to a territorial premier. They'll tell you about what's going on, and yet in this country we spend a paltry $250 million a year to deal with adaptation, to deal with the fact that Premier Paslowski in Yukon has a school falling in on itself because the permafrost is melting. We got $250 million in all of this federal government programming on climate change to actually deal with adaptation. So that's point number one. We asked that the federal government would double that, and for our part, we're going to continue to support increased supports to our University of Saskatchewan Crop Development Centre. A big part of adaptation is food security. We need to grow crops that are resilient to climate change, and we need to continue to research crops that actually fix nitrogen to the soil, because that also captures, that absorbs CO2 as well, and that's part of adaptation. The second part's about innovation and our continued efforts in CCS, Mr. Speaker, that aren't just about BD3, but also about the test station at Coronach, where other companies can come in and test their own technologies. It's also about AquaStore, where we're testing new ways to store CO2. What we need to get to, I would say, members of the House and Mr. Speaker, where we need to get to is the point where what's working in Boundary Dam 3 is not reliant on enhanced oil recovery to make it work financially, and that we can store CO2 efficaciously in things like formations, geological aqua formations, and we're doing that research here too in the province. That research will be available to the world. And I would say that that's pretty important, Mr. Speaker, and here's why. Because while we're having this debate about a carbon tax in this country, which, if successful, would help reduce a third of 1.6% of global emissions. That's what we're talking about. In our province, by the way, where we're responsible for 10% of emissions, it's 10% of 30% of 1.6% of global emissions. But while we are focused on a carbon tax to achieve that reduction of 1.6%, about a third of 1.6% of global emissions, according to the Paris Accord, there are 2,400 coal plants on the books or being built around the world. And the emissions from those coal plants represents 6.5 billion tons per year. The amount of reductions we're after in Canada to reach our target, 221 million tons. That's the reduction we're after. So we could hit our target, Mr. Speaker, and a carbon tax won't do it. We know that from the BC example. But let's just say it might. Carbon tax gets us to 220 million tons less. Meanwhile, when these plants are built, there's 6.5 billion tons being emitted in coal. So we say in the province of Saskatchewan, we've got to find a solution for coal. And that's a role we can play. Maybe other provinces can pick out their spots in terms of technological innovation. Here's our spot we can pick out, because we made this investment going back years, because this technology is working, because 31 countries from around the world have come to Estevan to find out what's going on, because the United Nations, in advance of Paris, when they canvassed all the countries that were participating to find a highlight of success in each country, they found one in Canada that they noted before the Paris conference, and it was Boundary Dam 3. That's our spot. That's our spot. Mr. Speaker, Jim Yong Kim is the president of the World Bank. Here's what he said about coal in Asia. This is very recently, and I quote, "If Vietnam goes forward with 40 gigawatts of coal, if the entire region implements the coal-based plan right now, I think we are finished," close quote. What he's referring to there is Paris. What he's referring to there is trying to reduce the temperature by 2 degrees, so the growth by 2 degrees. That's the goal of Paris. The president of the World Bank, not some Sask Party politician or someone trying to advance some interest in fossil fuels. The president of the World Bank says unless we do something about Asian coal plants, and specifically Vietnam, we are finished. And what have we been doing in our country? We've been spending all of the oxygen and all of the resources and all of the time around debating a carbon tax, a carbon price that, if successful, and again it's questionable, would reduce emissions around the planet by 1/3 of 1.6%. That's what our white paper says. It says Canada should be aspirants to more than that. We can be technological leaders because of what's going on in our province. That's what we should be doing. That is the focus that we would want to present to our federal government, and why we're opposed to this particular carbon tax. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, this tax may be revenue neutral, I guess, in principle, but it is not sector neutral. And it is not neutral as to the regions of this country. There are 2 provinces that will pay mightily with jobs that Saskatchewan and Alberta families depend on if this tax goes ahead. And all the revenue neutral bell whistles don't change the fact that when you make this carbon intense part of Canada's economy uncompetitive, it's going to go somewhere else. And so will those jobs. You know, the economists call it carbon leakage. But here we call it layoffs in Saskatchewan. We call it declining business and declining opportunity. And if we let that happen, Mr. Speaker, we have less of a tax base upon which to provide better health care and better education and to fix more roads. And we are determined that it not happen in Saskatchewan. If pricing is to happen in the province, it'll be through a tech fund. It'll be through a levy, and only when the economy has returned to strength. Only when such an initiative would not cost jobs, cost Saskatchewan families. There have been thousands of layoffs in the oil and gas sector, and we will fight any effort from the federal government to make that situation worse for either those families or other families who depend, frankly, on a federal government that might understand the situation here. For many, many, many years, these provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta have provided, and they still do today, opportunity for other Canadians. And we've seen them come and work here and then go back sometimes to Atlantic Canada, but that's when the country's working at its best. And well, we are proud to play that role. That's a role we didn't always play in this country. We're proud that we play that role as a HAB province. We say to the federal government, let it continue. Let's actually focus on the real problem, and let us not go down the road with an ill-considered and reckless carbon tax that will cost the jobs of Canadians without any relief in sight, Mr. Speaker. And so I will move that this motion, that this Assembly supports the Government of Saskatchewan's position on climate change as outlined in the Climate Change White Paper released on October 18, 2016, and further, that this Assembly opposes the federal government's plan to impose a national carbon tax. Hear, hear.